All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, August 16th of 2022. Thank you for tuning into the stream here today. We've got a handful of questions in front of us for today's stream, a few about the sliders, default sliders, sliders in between different contests. We have a couple questions, just it looks like about reviewing yesterday's slate, about a couple specific things there. I noticed a question as well about, oh no, that's about sliders as well. So, a couple different, contest focused slider type questions here to get us kicked off. But as always, if it's your first time tuning in, first of all, welcome. My name's Jordan. And on this show, I answer questions from the SaberSim community about how to use our tools to build better DFS lineups. So if you have questions you'd like me to answer, you can pop them into YouTube chat if you're joined with me here live. You can also ask them in the Office Hours channel in our Slack community. And you can email us, support@sabersim.com. Those three channels, all good ways to get your questions answered here on this stream. So 13 game slate here tonight. Interesting one before we dive into the questions. Just a couple of my quick thoughts on the slate. Interesting slate. We get these every so often, but a slate where doesn't feel like we are going to have much of ownership condensing around any particular plays. I think you are going to see Robbie Ray as kind of the best and most popular pitching option, but nothing out of control there. A handful of quality pitchers on the slate here tonight, probably the combination of the best matchup and the best price for Robbie Ray there. That's going to drive up his ownership a little bit. I think 30% is pretty much nails it. I think that's like where my head is at on where he's probably going to be owned at the moment. Hitting is going to be super interesting. I think we will see these numbers condense a little bit more throughout the day, but at the moment, our highest projected hitter on the slate is Devers at 10.5%. And I think, we may see a couple guys creep up into 15% or so range, but really doesn't seem like we're going to have like a really chalky slate on any hitting stacks. There are a lot of teams projected for the high 5-ish runs. There's also just a lot of good teams on the slate that are not projected for as many runs, right? I think even, there will be a little bit of ownership that sneaks into the Astros and the Dodgers, even though they are both, facing good pitchers. They're good teams. They're high salary players that people like to click on. So interesting slate here tonight. I think this is probably shaping up to be, at least at the moment, like the least ownership focused slate of the year that I've seen so far. So kind of fun slate. We'll see how it all shakes out. I'm sure we'll end up building some lineups here as we move along. I did a initial test build earlier this morning. And it seems like our Sims are kind of liking Boston. Quite a bit. I was seeing a lot of Boston popping up there. So we will see how things shake out as we move along here today. But anyway, let's go ahead. Let's start answering some questions. I'm going to get started. There was a question that came in via email that I think is a good place to start here today. So let me get that pulled back up on screen here. Oops. Let's take that over here. And we'll get this going here. Sorry, I normally have these pulled up and forgot to grab this one before we started. So let me go ahead and just get this question pulled up. But, excuse me, it's about building lineups together or separate based on the way that the sliders kind of fit together. So this is a question from Sarosh here, and it will get our stream kicked off. So question that comes to mind today is regarding the building process for multiple contests. In previous office hours, Jordan mentioned that you guys are currently researching whether to build for each contest separately or do a 150 build out of a 1,500 lineup pool. But what contest entry size fits all for that build? Because the single entries usually have less than 1,000 or 1 to 10K entries, which obviously affects the sliders when you change that to 10 to 50K or greater than 50. So in that 150 lineup build, what would you recommend? 10 to 50K or greater than 50? Thanks again. As always, I appreciate it. Yeah, good question. So I have mentioned this before, that, there's kind of a trade-off here, right? Our contest selection portfolio recommendations will typically have you playing a wide variety of different contests, right? You will have some single entries that are maybe even as small as like this, or maybe even as small as this. And you'll probably have some 150 max contests that are 50K. that are 10 to 50K, right? Depending on the site that you're playing on. And there's a variety of different optimal sliders here. Now, most of the time, I recommend that people build all of their lineups together, all in one build. And the reason why is because I basically think that the value that you get out of having a unique entry into every single contest that you're playing, a unique lineup into every single entry that you're playing, as well as just having one build from which to manage all of your exposures and things like that, is more valuable than the slider trade-off, right? Than the fact that you'd technically be building for single entry contests with a 20 max set of sliders or a 150 max set of sliders, right? That is what I have found using SaberSim extensively, talking with the rest of the team. But at the moment, I think it is safe to say that that is kind of an intuitive stance, or that is a qualitative stance that I can't necessarily back up with data. Now, it is possible that it is more valuable to build. It is more valuable to build with the exact precise sliders for the particular contest that you're building, and sacrificing the efficiency of having just one build to manage, and also sacrificing the potential chance that you might duplicate yourself in between different builds. That remains to be seen. I think at the moment, what I would recommend doing is building everything all in one build, and picking a midpoint set of sliders based on what your contest portfolio looks like. I think a very good set of midpoint sliders that kind of fits everything that you may be playing is something around the 20 max 10 to 50K range, assuming you are picking your contests in the DFS Profit Plan framework, right? These sliders will generally give you what I feel like are a good baseline of lineups and lineup constructions that fit all of those different contest types. Yes, you might fade ownership a little bit more, or take maybe a little bit more of a high variance stand on your single entry lineups, but I think those lineups are still likely to be good. I think those lineups are still profitable. They're still plus EV for those particular contests. So that is what I'd recommend doing. So if you're playing 165 lineups across all of these different contests, I would probably set my sliders. Sometimes I actually use the 150 max here, but I would probably set my sliders at something like this and build something like this and manage all of my entries within this one build using that midpoint set of sliders. Now, in our slider backtesting project that is currently going on, that we've been talking about in Behind the Sims, if we find that the differences between sliders are very different between contests, that the optimal sliders are there's a significant difference between what you should be playing at a certain contest versus another, we will probably change that stance. I don't expect to see that. In fact, if you asked for my gut kind of opinion on how that research has been going so far, I actually think that we overrate slightly the differences between contests on a given slate, that the actual optimal sliders for one given slate are actually a little bit more similar between contests, and that something like slate size is actually a bigger factor in terms of determining what the optimal strategy is. That even a single entry of 1,000 people or something like that is not as far off as from a 20 max of 10,000 people that our sliders would imply, right? That's kind of my expectations of what we'll see, but I will, of course, edit my stance here on this as we move along in that project. But for now, I would say, I think because it makes your process more efficient, it makes your process easier to do, and because it will make sure that you are playing truly a unique lineup into every entry, I think my personal recommendation is to run one build where you are building all of your lineups for your contest portfolio that day, and going from there. So good first question to get us started off here. I think there's a couple other questions about sliders and things like that that will kind of help continue to take us along here. So okay. So a good question here from Reed in a bit of a similar vein here. This is from Slack. And he said, when you speak about sliders potentially being a little bit... Okay, wait. When you speak about sliders potentially being a little better, like sim precision down as contests get bigger and correlation up for bigger, do you mean by entrance or number of baseball games in the contest? If by entrance, what might be a directionally correct option for number of games? Okay, interesting. So, I mean, both of those factors impact the sliders, right? Both the entrance in the contest and the and the slate size, the number of baseball games on the slate. Directionally, you can kind of see some of this here. Like if you pick a single entry, for example, and then move your entrance up, you will see slowly that the sim precision will come up, right? Basically, you need to get further away from the average projections. You need to accept more variance in your lineups to be successful here as the size of the contest gets bigger. So I think directionally speaking, that is accurate for entrance. As the contest gets larger, it is generally in your favor to play with a higher sim precision, right? You need a thinner range of outcomes would be another way of looking at that. What is profitable for that kind of contest, right? You need to be more right when you are right as the contest gets bigger. So it makes sense that sim precision would get higher. Slate size is a little bit harder to see in that same way because you would have to, you can back up. So we have you could use like a 13 game slate like tonight and then check yesterday's 10 game slate and then, maybe Saturday's 8 game slate or whatever it was and kind of check. I will just tell you, as the size of the slate gets bigger right now, the sim precision slider comes down a little bit as slate size gets bigger. As slate size gets smaller, sim precision goes up, right? And it's kind of a similar thing. As the size of the player pool gets bigger, it leaves more room for other people to make mistakes, right? You can rely on kind of just a pure projection edge a little bit more than really needing to get like highly variant and diversified like you might need in a 2 or 3 game slate. Now, the caveat here, right, is again, this is stuff that we are currently investigating. Like as we speak here, this is a research project that we are currently doing. So some of this stuff is subject to change as we wrap that up. We're getting close to the end, but I think in general, those are still going to be trends that make a lot of intuitive sense, and I expect to probably still see those coming out of the other side of this project. Contest gets bigger, requires more sim precision. Sim precision goes up. Contest gets bigger, or slate size gets bigger, sim precision comes down. So, good question there. Okay, a couple questions here from Kino. Also about the sliders here. I might be wrong, but I think the sliders were backtested for the flagship contests and playing lots of the mini-max, which aren't as top-heavy as the flagship ones. So lately, I've been experimenting with lowering the ownership fade slider by 1 or 2 levels. Does this seem sound to you, or do you have any other recommendations? So I actually, basically the way this actually works is we will, if you're talking about these sliders, right, 150 max, 10 to 50K, this is actually a bucket that includes all of the contests that match that match these metrics. So this would include a bucket of your flagships and your mini maxes along with it. One thing that actually the default sliders and the kind of the default buckets don't do a very good job of right now is thinking about payout structure, right? They think about payout structure insofar as we are looking at the payout structure of a contest when we are calculating out the ROI of different lineups built at certain settings. But because they all kind of get averaged back into the same buckets and there isn't like another setting specifically for top heavy contests of this type or bottom or flatter payout structures contests of this type, right? They're not really captured in that way. So here's what I think. I actually personally, I like to think about this as kind of a baseline contest type. And rather than saying, oh, a mini-max has a lower contest or a flatter payout structure, I'm going to turn down the ownership fade slider. I would actually probably more likely to say that the flagship has a particularly top-heavy payout structure and instead increase the ownership fade slider and maybe the sim precision slider if I was playing that, right? Like put another way, I think rather than saying this is mini-maxy, I would probably say just increasing like the entrance up one more tick is a little bit more resembles the optimal strategy for a top heavy flagship kind of contest. But that's also a little bit personal taste. I would prefer at the end of the night to think, man, I probably was a little bit too aggressive with my ownership fade and sim precision than the other way around. I would like to feel like, man, I probably maybe pushed an ownership edge or tried to exploit the field a little bit too much on that particular slate or diversified too much rather than feeling like I played lineups that were too chalky. So it's kind of up to you a little bit there. But I do think in general, I would not worry about lowering sliders. This is just a general trend. I would probably not worry about lowering sliders for flat payouts. I would probably be more focused on increasing your sliders on top heavy payouts. Right. The other thing too, and this is a little bit anecdotal as well, but as you lower sliders, you are approaching more of what a traditional optimizer would do. SaberSim is resembling a traditional optimizer more and more. And that's not to say that the optimal sliders for a contest are ever this, right? Or at least we don't think they are. But I think, like, all else being equal, avoid looking for reasons to lower your sliders is a decent rule of thumb using SaberSim. Because what really makes SaberSim is, at least in part, is the way that some of these sliders are applied and what they actually do to your lineups. So I often find myself looking for reasons to increase my sliders for particular contests as opposed to decreasing them and finding reasons to decrease them. So, but good question there. Let's see, another question here from Kino. This one looks kind of like an explaining the build kind of question. Some of these are tough. I'll do my best with this particular question. It said, for yesterday's main slate, I kept getting a very chalky Houston stack no matter what, which was weird how close the projected totals were across all teams. It seemed like a local minimum trap, so I had to bump up ownership fade and precision sliders to escape it. Do you have any ideas on why this might have happened? Yeah, these are tough questions. Like, explain the build, explain the reason why. I will say, in particular, we do, like, our model does kind of like Houston as an offense. Like, we are consistently a tad higher than I think the field is on Houston across the board, especially at their upside outcomes, right? Especially for like their power bats. Yordan Alvarez, we generally like his home run props. Even Kyle Tucker and Bregman, right? Like we're pretty bullish on the Houston offense, not in a way that I think is like out of control or anything like that, but I think that's like a common trend, especially if you're using a like field adjusted ownership model or something like that, or ownership projections from something else, from somewhere else. You might find that you're getting like even more Houston because they will not have been a little bit adjusted here for the fact that we like them more. I mean, I will say, just looking at this here, like, we'll just do a quick glance. One, outside of Alvarez, they're pretty cheap, right? This was a pretty affordable Houston lineup here tonight. Kyle Tucker was 47, Bregman was 49. I mean, Dubon was hitting first at 2,500, right? This was an affordable team. They did project pretty well, and they were pretty low owned in our ownership model as well, right? Like, I guess ownership was pretty spread out yesterday too. But a combined set of factors, I think, is probably what led to you getting a lot of them. I would say, honestly, what you did is probably correct. If it looked too high to you, adjusting your sliders or just capping your exposure would have been totally fine. That's what I did. I ran my build. I saw a lot of Houston. I still wanted a lot of Houston. They were my number one stack when it was all said and done. But I did cap my exposure to Houston bats, basically for that reason. So, cool. Okay. Jimmy says, let's take a look here. Feels like I'm missing the mark when it comes to value and leverage. What are some key indicators you look for when trying to incorporate this in your build? I usually try and do the research build and compare the exposure versus the ownership percentage as the example. Yeah, so that is, I mean, that's what I do too. Like, historically, what I have done is compared the research build, like the exposure in the research build to the exposure in to the ownership percentage. I will say, I have been experimenting with doing something a little bit different here recently, ever since we basically came up with this new pool column, right? And what I've been experimenting with instead is, I'll show you, is building lineups here, basically for the contest that you're actually building here, right? So this is I'll say this, I couldn't get it out of my head, especially in a sport like baseball, that you don't actually need the optimal to win, right? This was something that I've talked about this on stream before. One of the main limitations of the research build is that, you are assuming that the probability of a player showing up in the optimal lineup is the probability of that player showing up in the winning lineup for a contest. And I couldn't get that out of my head that technically was not like a very good assumption at all. One thing I have been experimenting a little bit more with here recently is instead building my lineups with like a very big pool, so 1,500 pool here in this case, but building them on the sliders that are appropriate for that contest and using that pool column, that new total pool column, to kind of help guide some of my decision making. And I think this might be a simpler approach because I do think the research build tends at times to confuse sometimes here. I mean, it sounds like at least in this case it has. So let's let this build and I'll kind of talk about what I've been looking at a little bit instead here, at least in the past week, or at least as another option. And maybe this will help maybe give you another way of looking at it. So we'll give this a moment to build here and talk about that. So, and I will be sure here to try to talk about this particularly from the standpoint of key indicators. I think that's a good, I think that is a good way to say that. So I will do my best to talk about that. And I'm going to let this build out in full. I think it's important here that we do have a large pool to work with this. And I see some questions coming in YouTube chat as well. I will get to YouTube chat here after this question, actually. So, but 13-game baseball slate here tonight. Should be fun. I'm looking forward to it. I mentioned here before on stream, I am a big slate fan when it comes to baseball. They're always kind of my favorite slates. I like having a lot of different ways to go, a lot of different opportunities a lot of different angles to play on the slate. So we will see how it all shakes out. Okay. So let's pull this up here now. So one thing I do right away, and this column is kind of hidden. I think some people, because of the way that this is laid out, I think there's some people that don't even know this is here, but this column is new, right? This is the pool column. What this is this is the percentage of lineups in your entire pool of 1,500 lineups that have that particular player in it, or that stack type, or anything like that, right? This pool of lineups, this is a 1,500 lineup pool that was built and optimized for this contest, 150 max, 10 to 50K, right? So this is essentially a 1,500 different ways that you could strategize, you could play this particular slate. So this number, I think, kind of helps put into context in maybe a way that is a little bit more well adjusted for the content, for what it takes to actually beat that contest, of how often you maybe want to use that player. So a couple key indicators. Let's talk about this key indicators thing, right? A couple key indicators that I've been using. One thing that I like to look at is what is the most frequently, like what player and how likely is any one given player likely to be in a given winning lineup, right? This number, right? This is basically the pool, the percentage of lineups in the entire pool that have a given batter in it is helping me to frame how exposed I want to be to any one hitter, right? If the most likely player to be in a good lineup for this contest is Devers at 28%, I don't know if I really want to be like higher than 30%, 28% or so on any given other hitter in the pool, right? Like, do I really want, you can see that we just like very much favor a Boston stack here, but do I really want, I don't know, do I want 63% Devers when he is the most likely player to be in a winning good lineup for this contest, and that only happens 28% of the time? For me, the answer is kind of no. There's clearly a lot of other ways to play. So I've been bringing down my exposure then and saying I don't want more than 30% of any one batter, right? The other thing I've kind of been looking at, so I'll go ahead and do this real quick, is I'll look at basically how does the ownership shake out relative to that player's probability of being in the pool, right? And I think this is where in particular, this maybe is actually a little bit better than what I was doing before. Like, for example, Robbie Ray tonight, he's 30% owned. And I imagine if you do a 0-0-10 research build, it would tell you to be under on Robbie Ray. It would probably say his percent chance of being optimal I'll just take a guess, is around 20%. But we actually see here, according to this build, that he's actually kind of efficiently owned, right? This isn't saying what is his probability of being the optimal lineup, but this is saying what is the probability that he's in a good lineup for this contest in a way that's already ownership adjusted. And I can see that actually it seems like I think the field is kind of being about appropriate with the way that they're getting exposed to Robbie Ray. But maybe there's an opportunity on Verlander here, right? That Verlander is actually a little bit underappreciated here. He's in 24% of my pool lineups, but only in 16% of my 16% of the field's lineups. And you can see that kind of explains why we are getting exposure to him. Why are we 2x the field on Verlander? Well, he's a good play, right? It doesn't seem like the field is appropriately, using him. So what I've been doing here is I've been going and kind of looking for discrepancies here in between these numbers, and then making sure I'm getting exposures to the plays where I think there are opportunities, right? Sometimes this just happens automatically. You can see on the flip side, Nestor Cortez actually kind of looks like a fade, right? He's not in a ton of the lineups in the pool, only 11%, but he's going to be in 17% of the field's lineups. I'm not super interested there. I'll do this with stacks as well. So what I've been going through and doing here is basically looking at tonight's not a great example because the ownership is pretty spread out. But what I'll do is I'll go through and look at the pool lineups and think, okay, what teams are showing up as good plays in the entire pool here, right? So let me turn status off so we can see this, right? What teams are frequently showing up here when we sort by pool, right? What stacks does the builder like? Clearly, Boston, Cleveland, the Cubs, and Oakland and Toronto, right? And what I'm looking for is, are they showing up more frequently in the pool than they are owned by the field, right? And in the case of Boston, Cleveland, Chicago, and Oakland, that all kind of seems true. Once we get down to here to around this point, you can see this is kind of balancing itself out, right? Let's see, let's keep going, right? As you can see, Seattle, sure, yeah, maybe there's a little bit of an opportunity there. Here, I'll keep going. Right, we're seeing more even exposure to a player in the pool than the ownership, right? So to me, those are more fairly owned. And then what I'll do is I'll go over to the teams tab and kind of make sure that is actually working out in my lineups, right? Here's a decent example where, Oakland actually stands out to me as a team that it looks like his ownership is going to be kind of inefficient on. They're in 16% of my lineups in the pool, but I'm actually under that 16% mark in my final 150. I might want to make sure that I'm actually getting there, because that's a spot to me that looks like a good opportunity, right? So I'm gonna do that instead. Let's see. Was there another team? Boston, Cleveland, Chicago. Those are all showing up at the top. Also, on a slate where there's actually more chalk, I'll look at the highest owned guys as well and see are they efficiently owned based on what's showing up in my pool. So a couple days ago we had a slate. We had a Coors slate where the Diamondbacks were in Coors. And that was actually an interesting situation where when I did this process, I found that on DraftKings, I thought the Diamondbacks were inefficiently owned, right? They were showing up in a lot less of my lineups in my pool than the field was going to own them. But they were actually a little bit under-owned, even as the most likely to be optimal stack on FanDuel. So I ended up over the field on the Diamondbacks using this process on FanDuel and under on DraftKings based on kind of the way that the pricing and the positions and salaries and things like that worked out. So basically, this pool here will tell you very quickly just what randomly sampling your 1,500 lineups looks like. And I think it will help guide you in decisions about how risk averse you want to be, right? How risk tolerant you want to be, and where maybe there are opportunities to take a little bit of an additional stance against ownership and things like that. I have found this pool column to be very, very helpful to me recently. So you can also do it with stacks, right? And this has been something that's been interesting to me as well. So historically, I have not played a lot of these smaller stack types, but it is interesting to me that they're, the same correlation setting that is leading to me getting 21% 4-3 stacks and 28% 5-2 stacks is saying, 7% of the time, a 3-3-2 stack makes sense. And I've actually thought on a 13-game slate like tonight, I don't know if I'm going to get there, but I have been starting to allow sometimes a little bit smaller stack types than I'm used to into my builds, because they like have viability and they have a presence in my 1500 pool. Jimmy, let me know if that helps. I was trying to kind of focus on those key indicators, things I look at there. Again, I think because of some of the bad assumptions that are present in a research build, I have been approaching with a bit more caution there recently, especially now that this pool column exists. The nice thing about this strategy is if we go over to something like MMA, for example, and look at last week's card, if you were to do this for an MMA slate, right, the same way of thinking, and you build your lineups, and instead of running a research build, you just build your actual lineups, you will build on something that is very close to a research build. Basically, like you will kind of naturally get a research buildy product out of just what your actual build is. In other words, like you're essentially kind of running research builds, but at the sliders that actually make sense for the contest that you're playing. Anyway, I would say this. If I have lost you again here and you're like, man, I am just not getting this, I'm going to have a hard time following this, I would probably say take a step back and focus less on this side of this here and focus more on trying to come to an understanding of what you are getting in your lineups just as they come out of your default build, of your build that you would actually use to build your lineups. Because I do think this is kind of an optional and a more kind of an optional add-on once you've got a strong grasp of what's happening by default. And I think it would be better to spend your time looking at like what is the product I'm getting out of my build, and then what is my personal risk tolerance, and adjusting your exposures from there before you try to think about how you are going to leverage ownership in a more custom manual way for your own process. But I'm happy to talk about it further. Let me know if that kind of helps get you on the path there, and we can come back to this as well. So I saw I need to learn to adjust player exposures as well. I'm big on adjusting team exposures manually. Yeah, that's also like, that is really a personal preference thing. If you prefer to edit team exposures, I think that's fine. One thing that I've been doing here is, again, like we can let me say it this way. We can apply the same process here, right? And kind of say, okay, clearly we like Boston tonight, right? But how much should we like Boston? Well, they're showing up in 83% of our 150. That's too much for me. How much should I cap them, right? What is an appropriate amount of exposure? Well, in our entire pool of lineups, they show up 40% of the time. That's going to still make us well over the field on their ownership. Maybe we have 40% Boston stacks instead. And we can do that from the Boston standpoint as well. And you can apply your own personal touch here as well. Like, one thing that I've noticed on yesterday's slate, and I think we're going to have again today here, I mentioned it at the start of the stream, is that we have good teams facing good pitchers that I think are going to get very low ownership, right? On a 13-game slate, I don't think many people are going to get to the Dodgers. And you might ask yourself, are the Dodgers viable on tonight's slate? Should I play Dodgers bats? I have 0% Dodgers, right? In my 150, maybe not. But you have 9%. Oh, you guys can't see that. You have 9% in your pool, right? How much Dodgers should we get to if we want to get to them? Well, maybe 9%, right? Or 10%, right? We match the actual, then we have 15 lineups, and we actually match the pool exposure to the Dodgers in our set here, right? So you could do this. You can do this from the stacking page as well, right? And I think this is like a really interesting way to build out some of these lineups and make some stands here, right? I think the stack pool, this pool exposure column has really kind of changed the way that I'm thinking about some of this stuff and selecting for some of my lineups. So, okay, cool. Let's jump over to YouTube chat. Tom said, in MLB, what's the highest hitting projected points for one player? I don't know. I think feel like most slates probably like somewhere between like 10 and 13 DraftKings points is like the highest average projection. Depends on the size of the slate, depends on who's on the slate and where they're playing. But that's like probably on average about what you see. I mean, not so 9.66 tonight. Rafael Devers is our highest projected hitter. But on a Coors slate, like if the Dodgers are in Coors, you might have like Freddie Freeman projected for 13 points or something like that. So it depends a lot on the slate. Tom says, is it good to go against a high-owned pitcher with low-owned bats? I think it can depend. I think it kind of depends on the quality of that pitcher and the quality of the opposing team, as well as kind of the park factors at play there. SaberSim will help combine all of these different factors and help make a decision. It also depends on the contest you're playing. I should say that. That's probably the most important thing. In a single entry 150-man contest, you might not need to do that. In a large field GPP, maybe it's a good play. A couple things that I like to look at, one is I differentiate between like high quality pitching chalk and lower quality pitching chalk, right? Yesterday is a good example where Garrett Cole was 55% owned, right? That's a high quality pitcher, right? He can still get blown up, but that is a better, you can even just tell just purely based on the DraftKings salary, right? When there is a chalky pitcher that's 8K or less, to me, that's more of a red flag than a chalky pitcher that is 9K or more, right? Most of the time. It also depends on who they're playing, right? Robbie Ray against this like terrible Angels lineup feels a little bit safer than even somebody like Dylan Cease, who is playing basically the best version of the Houston lineup, right? Like, I think there's a difference there in terms of deciding what you want to do there. There's also, there's park factors too. Like I always, one thing that did make me a little bit cautious about Cole yesterday, and I think he ended up doing okay. It wasn't the worst outing. It wasn't the best outing for Cole, but Yankee Stadium does scare me a little bit, right? That's a park that especially, fly ball pitcher like Cole, that's a park that, can lend itself to some power, giving up some home runs. Similar thing we've had going on in Washington the past few weeks here, where Washington is really bad. Their lineup most nights looks pretty bad, but Washington is a very home run friendly park. I think you are often finding that the pitcher pitching against the Nationals when they're playing at home ends up projecting pretty well and is sometimes pretty cheap, but sometimes that's, a little bit scary there on the other side. So I would say a couple things to think about. I think this is in general often a good idea, right? You get direct leverage on a play that basically like the thesis of this play, the reason why you're doing that is, let's say tonight that you want to fade Robbie Ray, right? You don't want to play Robbie Ray. The most positively correlated outcome to that particular play paying off is the Angels having success, right? That's the idea of what you're doing here. You're saying, I'm already not going to play Ray. I'm going to play two other pitchers. Well, what is the most correlated outcome to that lineup being successful? It would be the Angels having success, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that that correlation always adds up to enough of a reason to play the Angels, but that's the thesis of the play, right? So the things I would think about when you're deciding whether or not you want to actually do this are how big is the contest, right? How important is it actually that I take that big of a stand? But then also, what's the quality of the pitcher? What's the quality of the bats on the other side? And what does the overall game situation, the park and the weather look like? Those are the kinds of things that I like to think about. And also I think the last thing I'll mention here is the raw ownership matters a little bit as well. Like I snuck in some Rays stacks yesterday just because Cole was 60% owned, 50% owned. I don't know tonight if I will force in Angel stacks against a 30% owned Robbie Ray, just because you're getting less direct leverage against that. So I think the raw ownership number depends as well. But Cole says, do you guys have any plans to adjust the stacking rules for the NFL season? I know you aren't a fan of using these hardcore coded rules, but they are very limited at the moment for NFL. We are in process of a complete overhaul to our stacking and grouping rules to add way more functionality and way more customization. Our goal with this update is basically to allow you to do almost virtually any lineup construction rule that you want. Anything. Conditional rules, different combinations of players, everything. That is basically the way we designed it, is basically to allow you to do whatever you want. We are in a full-on dev sprint to push that out before week 1. I cannot make a promise that it will be ready before week 1, but it will be ready early in the football season. So short answer is yes. We have heard this, and we know that this is something that people want. So yes, and it will not just be for football. I mean, it will be for everything. So Do I think baseball DFS is slowly fading? NFL is beginning to ramp up with the contest selection. Yeah, a bit, but the contests have stayed pretty strong the past couple weeks. So, it's getting to be that time of the year. When football comes around, they will get a little bit smaller. Especially on the football days, like baseball contests on Monday, Thursday, and Sunday are pretty weak once football starts. But Tuesday, when there's generally 10 plus baseball games and no football, is still a pretty good baseball DFS day, and so is Fridays. So Tom says, would I prefer a 4 to 3 man stack? Very generally speaking, I would say yes. I like, all other things being equal, generally want my stacks to be bigger. There is some, nuance there, mostly in terms of what the size of the slate is and what contest you're playing. But yes, broadly speaking, I would probably prefer 4 to 3 and 5 to 4 on DraftKings. So Josh said Boston and Cleveland showing up in all my lineups. Yeah, we like those teams today. I think things will settle in a little bit as we approach lock. I don't know. Again, it's kind of hard for me to explain like why that would be. I think Vegas likes both of those teams as well. I think it's a slate that I don't know why this keeps popping up. To me, looks like a good slate to spread out a little bit on. Personally, I'll probably spread out. So, especially on a team like Cleveland, right? Like Boston, if you just look at these exposures again, and again, it's a little after, or it's a little bit before 1:00 my time here, right? We're like 4 hours away from lock. Boston actually looks like we think there's an edge there, right? Like that the field is basically just like missing an opportunity here in Boston. Who's pitching for the Pirates, right? I think this is probably a pitching thing. Is it Bryce Wilson? That is who I feel like it is. Oh, it's Mitch Keller. Interesting. Okay, so it's possible that we're also just very bearish on Mitch Keller compared to the field here. The pool exposure to me basically makes it look like we think that there is an edge in playing Boston that is going overlooked. Cleveland, right? I would say less so. Right? Cleveland is kind of like in line with a lot of these other stacks. So if there was a stand to be made there, I think I like taking the Boston stand a little bit more than the Cleveland stand at the moment, just based on these numbers. But yeah, I think they're both good opportunities tonight. Eamon said, what's up, Air Jordan? What will happen to my lineups if I turn the ownership fade to 0? What about to 10? You don't want to turn it to 10. Your computer will start smoking. You'll see sparks flying out of the back of the monitor. The last thing you want to do, promise me, that you will never, ever, ever turn your ownership fade to 10. Promise me. No, I'm just kidding. The best advice I can give you is test it out yourself. I think there's no better way to learn what the sliders actually do than to play with them yourself and experiment. The answer, if you turn ownership fade to 0, we will basically just make no ownership-based adjustment to the lineups, right? To the player projections as we're building each one. Right, that's the way lineups get built in SaberSim. So, if you're building here and you build on these settings, basically what we'll do is we'll take a sim bucket. We'll randomly select 28 sims of each game and set the player projections to what they scored in those games. And then we'll start building correlated lineups based on those projections alone. When the ownership fade slider is on, ultimately what happens is those ownership projection or those player projections from that sim bucket get adjusted based on the player ownership. And the size of that adjustment is basically dependent on how high this slider is. So it's a huge adjustment on 10, and it's the neutral adjustment on 0. So that's basically what it does. And I do think, this is how I learned what the sliders do and how I gained an intuitive sense of what each kind of slider tick does is I started just building like very weird slider builds and playing with it and seeing what would happen. I think it's a great way to learn how the tools work. So Patrick says, could we still use the existing profit plan and apply it to NFL, or there'll be a revamped profit plan that will include NFL? You can absolutely apply the existing plan to NFL. And in fact, I'm planning on having some football-focused contest selection content come out before the start of the season, but it will basically just be me using the exact same framework and applying it to the NFL lobby. So yes, the DFS Profit Plan video as it is on YouTube can be basically one-to-one applied to the NFL lobby, and it should be successful. In fact, it should be easier to use because there's basically a large field tournament of every single like combination of metrics in NFL, right? Like you can basically play any entry limit, any size at any dollar amount in NFL and find a contest that fits that. So Neil says for NFL, I'm curious how the sliders will be updated this year. Feels like correlation slider maybe needs to go down for huge contests like the Millie and needs to go up for smaller fields. I'm more likely to have huge stacks in smaller fields. I'm probably not going above double stacking in the Millie. So two things on that. One, our ongoing slider project is targeted at this, and I expect we will have an update before the start of the season. Two, the sliders are averages of what we have found and what we believe to be best. But I do think this is a high value adjustment to make if you see an opportunity to do it, right? I want to make that. I want to make that clear. The sliders are so interesting because I get two types of questions. I get question one, someone comes onto the stream and says, what are the best sliders to use? The answer to that question is always the defaults, right? Then the other type of question I get is something like this, which is a pretty well-reasoned, intentional stance that you want to take, right? Like there's I feel like to build the best lineups possible for the Millie Maker, I should have correlation be a little bit lower, slightly smaller stacks. Is that okay? Basically, like, should I do that? I would say I would do that because you can defend to me why you want to make that change. And it would not surprise me if you were right about that. So a lot of times I think it's hard for me to answer slider questions sometimes on this stream, because when I answer this question, I'm going to have somebody listening to this stream who is basically like, oh, okay, then best sliders are what, like turn down correlation. And it's like, well, like maybe, yeah, I mean, it could be, but there needs to be a reasoning behind that. So all of this to say, if you have an unopinionated stance about the sliders and you're just looking for what the best baseline defaults are for a particular contest, then use the baseline defaults. But if you've got a well-reasoned stance on why for a particular contest type or even a particular slate, it makes sense to turn one of these sliders up or down, I give you my blessing on that, and I think that's a good idea. So I would agree that in a very large field tournament like an NFL Millie Maker, because you are going to need like such a high scoring lineup so close to the nuts, I think I probably would also say a QB +2 is the largest same team stack I would be willing to make. I would probably also have some QB +1s in there. But I personally, and this is almost somewhat procedural at this point, I would probably accomplish that rather than changing the correlation slider by making adjustments in the exposure settings. That's my personal procedural answer there. And Neil said, sorry, I didn't mean to open a can of worms. And no, it's not your fault at all. It's a great question. I think sometimes, especially, for people that maybe watch this every single day, we'll hear somewhat competing or conflicting advice where I'm telling some people to not touch their sliders and others to change their sliders. And I think the main thing is like really what is, and this is true even of other parts of SaberSim, what is your intention, right? And basically, can you articulate what the goal of doing the thing is? And when people can, then I say, yeah, it's probably a good idea. And when they can't, I say, then I'd probably leave it where it is, right? So anyway. Okay. Josh says, would love to see you guys add a feature where it shows the percent of each lineup being duplicated. So we've talked about this a lot. This has actually come up quite a bit. This is a challenging feature to build. And the main reason why it is challenging to build a duplication feature is because duplication mostly matters at the extremes, right? It matters in sports like NFL Showdown and MMA, and it matters most significantly at the very small numbers, right? A lineup being duplicated, a lineup showing up in a contest 2 times instead of once has a significant impact, and probably a much bigger impact than that lineup showing up in 40 lineups rather than 20, right? Same thing, the jump from 2 to 3 is also. So to be completely honest, you get yourself into this weird paradox where if we say that a lineup is going to be not duplicated, that will probably force that lineup to be duplicated just purely by the fact that there's going to be enough people on SaberSim using it. And like, all it takes is basically one other person building for the same slate and playing in the same contest as you that identifies a lineup that's basically not likely to be duplicated before you start to get into a weird, it almost makes the feature kind of eat itself. So we are still looking at this. I think we still want to at least give people better tools to make some of these decisions themselves. It does get very hard when you are actually trying to predict duplication in a product. Patrick says, did I get my webcam issue fixed yet? I think so. It seems like it's working pretty good today. So I think so. I don't know. AK said, I've tried ownership fade to 10 on MMA and it wasn't much different than 5, but it's also not many players to sort from. Yeah, MMA, pretty small pool there. I think, honestly, instead of just cranking the ownership fade slider, I think you will probably get better results making intentional ownership-based decisions on your own with your exposures and projections. I have found that as well. That's what I do. I typically find like a handful of fighters that I think are probably the worst chalk on a card, and then intentionally either bring their projection down or just cap my exposure to them in the post-build process as a way of kind of forcing a stand there. So Jimmy said, for your process you just displayed, does anything change if it's 2 to 3 games, say for Counter-Strike or League of Legends? Maybe at that point it's more about player adjustments rather than team. I think it still applies just as easily, right? So, let's go mess around with League of Legends here and say, okay, so 3 game, actually, do we have projections up for tomorrow? Let's see. Okay, so we have a 2-gamer for tomorrow. It looks like we already have projections, right? Okay, so this is an interesting one. So we'll just do a quick example. So we have basically 2 pretty heavy favorites. I've noticed there's a lot of slates like this in the league, right? Where you have 2 heavy favorites. And let's build, and let's say we're playing, I guess it's not really a 150 max. It's probably like something like this, right? Like this is probably what like the flagship would be. And maybe we're just playing 20 lineups, right? So let's build this. And I'm going to still build 1,500 here, right? I'm going to build 1,500 lineups. And let's take a look. And I think the process still works just the same way. So we'll let these build. If you want to ask like, hey, how viable is it to play a stack of some random underdog? I don't know, right? I think you could still use that pool column to see, in my 1,500 pool, what's the likelihood that lineup shows up? This is a 1,500 subset of potentially viable lineups for the contest. So let's let this build. Again, I think part of this, I think it is important to build a big pool to use this effectively. So I want to make sure I do that here. And we'll go from there. So we'll hit on a couple quick comments here in chat. Patrick said, any optimism for the Broncos this year? Losing Tim Patrick is a blow. Let risk cook. Yeah, I think the Broncos are going to be pretty good. I think we're definitely going to put up some points. I don't know. I think the defense, not so sure on. The AFC West is just going to be like chaos this year. I feel like those games, especially those divisional games, are going to be so high scoring. I just think there's going to be a lot of Chiefs, Chargers, Raiders, and Broncos stacking this year in DFS especially. So, okay, this actually looks like a real question, so I'll come back to that after this one. But okay, so our build's done. Now let's take a look, right? Okay, so how viable is I need to actually remember who these teams are. So let's pull this back up on a separate screen here. I don't know League well enough to intuitively say who the underdogs are here, just by looking at the teams. But I guess we could probably just reason it out, right? Just by looking at the exposures. But that's okay. Anyway, okay. So you're like, okay, so DRX is plus 293, right? Like how viable is a DRX stack? You're getting 25% in your pool already. They are showing up in your stack pool exposures 36.3% of the time, right? So maybe you say, maybe you're looking at this and you're like, hey, it's 2-game slate. Everybody's going to play the favorites. Like I want to get some exposure to the underdogs. How much exposure makes sense? Well, they're showing up at this rate in your pool, right? So as a starting point, at least, not to say this is the only way to do it, but as a starting point, maybe this much exposure makes sense, right? And there you go. And I think you can apply that here the same way. So. Okay, anyway, so AK said, I'm still trying to figure out a better way to get to most of the fighters in lineup so there's a little chance with everyone, because there's so much of a chance with each having the ability to be 50-50. Yes, okay, here, let's talk about MMA, right? I think you can do that here. And I did that, did that very same thinking last week here, right? So let's build some lineups. So let's say you're playing the Haymaker, right? Keeping in mind that, at a 20 max kind of contest, your ability to play everybody is limited, right? Also, another thing, I maybe I'm just a min salary truther, but especially for MMA, I don't want a min salary. It's just my take, right? We're basically using single sims anyway to build these lineups. So turn the min salary off. I don't care about my salary in MMA. So let's build it again. Let's talk about this, right? How I might use the pool to kind of think about this, right? You'll often find that in MMA, I think there's a couple underdogs or a couple fighters that are maybe just slighter favorites that start to get pretty chalky, right? Maybe because of pricing or ownership or one factor or another, there's a player that looks a little bit inefficient, right? You can use the pool exposure to kind of think about what is an appropriate, where is an appropriate amount of exposure to some of these fighters. To me, in both MMA and tennis, it is a red flag when there is a player, a underdog, whose exposure is far outweighing their win probability or their pool exposure to me, right? So let's actually go ahead and look at this. So for this, I will actually pull in the win odds as well and pull that over here as well. And all of a sudden, we start to have a really nice kind of set of numbers here. And let's turn status off. Okay. And now let's start looking, right? So what I was doing, what happened? Where did my win column go? Win percent. Did I reset it? There we go, win percent. Okay, so what I'll start doing, let's see if we can find one. And this actually looks pretty good, surprisingly here, right? This doesn't look too bad. Who was? Oh, Lipsky. Okay, so this isn't exactly what I saw when I actually built my lineups. And I don't know why that is necessarily, but when I built my lineups the other day, I was getting 65% Lipsky, who ended up losing, right? That's not the point here. 70% in my builds, right? I let this number help guide me as a reason to bring that down, right? I was like, man, that seems a little bit aggressive. How much exposure maybe is appropriate here? Well, she's in 31% of my lineups in my entire pool. Maybe that's a good starting point, right? So anyway, same kind of general thing here. AK said, oh yeah, seeing the sliders reminded me why I wanted to ask why correlation gets a 2 for MMA when it was 0 before. I don't know personally. Because it's not going to impact anything. It has no chance to impact anything because the only correlations in MMA are between opposing fighters, and that's almost always off. Now, I think mostly it's just a default that, if there was a very small card, I don't know at what point this turns on, but maybe on an 8-fight card or something like that, this slider might turn on. And then correlation is basically going to say, hey, it's okay if we play 2 fighters in the same fight, especially maybe in the main event. But we want to value correlation a little bit to emphasize not doing that where possible, right? That's all it is. So short answer, if this is off, it will have 0 effect on your lineups, none whatsoever. When this is on, it will basically give a slight push in the direction of favoring not using 2 fighters from the same fight, all else being equal. So cool. All right. AK said, yeah, I had 90% Lipsky, and I said, forget it. Let it roll just doing the 20 max, 25 cent last time I do that. Yeah, I mean, is what it is, right? The other side of that is if she wins the fight and you cap your exposure, you're like, dang it, the Sims were telling me to play a ton of her, and she won, and then now I cap my exposure. I think the best thing with your exposure limits is figure out what feels appropriate to you in terms of your risk tolerance. Be consistent with that and know that there's ups and downs there, right? Last night, I bumped up my Braves exposure. To me, it was like the perfect storm of good team that was virtually ignored by the field. Nobody wanted anything to do with the Braves in the best version of their lineup last night, right? I'm not the biggest Carlos Carrasco fan either, right? So I bumped up their exposure. I think I had 20% Brave stacks, and I lost like 50% of my entries last night, right? Like, sure, I could have locked the Braves in, and I probably would have printed, but that's not how I approach my those stances for me, and I take the ups and downs with that. So anyway, I think good opportunity to cap things off here for today. We are right at about the hour mark. So I appreciate everybody coming in, participating, hanging out here today. A big thank you, of course, to everybody that listens and watches this show as it goes up as a recording on YouTube and all the podcast outlets. Enjoy the slate here tonight. And I will see everybody again tomorrow, 2:00 Eastern. So in the meantime, thanks, good luck, and see ya.